Pick up immediately.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So, how do you go today? I see it said Teddy. You go by Teddy, Zooey?
Yeah, I go by Teddy now.
Teddy, okay.
Yeah.
That's the English name, huh?
Yeah, that's the one I use nowadays.
Okay. Well, let's see if I can remember that.
It's definitely more easier than the Yui, which is a bit hard for you to pronounce. I know that.
Yeah. Okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. So, yeah, finishing school early. So, I will be graduating from bachelor this year in June.
Well, that's great. And you say early. When were you supposed to graduate?
Well, normally people graduate school like 3 or 4 years. I'm finishing school in 1 year and 8 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
You've been busy then.
Yeah, I didn't have any summer holidays for this 2 years.
Yeah.
So no summer, like 3 weeks of winter holidays, and that's it.
And then you go into like a graduate program or something. Is that right?
Now I go into a master program.
Master, same place or?
Yeah, same university.
Okay. All right. Cool. I'm glad it's going well for you. I'm sure you had to adapt to the cold. I see you got your knitted cap on.
Yep. This kept me warm like for the last 2 years. I still wear it for luck.
Well, you're young. You can handle the cold better than us old people. So
I think it's equally cold right now in Eugene. It's like 2 degrees outside.
it's finally warmed up a little bit, but it was that cold. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. How about you? What's the temperature?
I think it's like -1.
Oh, not so bad.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not so bad now. It was a bit rainy when I was outside just now, but besides that, everything's cool.
Okay, good, good. Well, it's good to see you, and I'm glad it's going well. So you got a paper you're working on, huh?
Yeah. Do you want me to like send the topic again to you, or you want me to like just start right away?
Well, it was called a hypothesis, but what wasn't really clear to me, usually a hypothesis has a statement that I believe following, but it was more a subject to me than a hypothesis.
It was a topic subject. It was not a hypothesis. A hypothesis is something that I have to come up when I actually start writing the paper. Right now, I'm just like gathering data to actually to understand like what kind of hypothesis should I have.
I got it. I got it. Well, why don't you just tell me in your own words, though, what the subject and what you're trying to learn in this whole thing, right?
Yeah. So let me try to look it up. Where did I put it? There we go. So the research topic that I have is the relationship between expat or foreign managers and local managers, a case study of that was Scanner Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm trying to work on is I try to understand how these two different parties communicate with each other and solve problems together, like to see if they have any conflict and how they resolve the conflict with each other.
Okay.
In the study case of the company, of course.
Okay. And you were very specific because you're talking expats specifically with the local staff, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That narrows it quite a bit because there's also the interaction of staff outside of the local organization that is, I would say, even almost more challenging, to be honest with you, just so you're aware. So.
Yeah, but I'm trying to narrow it down. It's just like it's
kind
of a small environment. I don't want to make it too wide. Then I have to change the topic again.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to be really clear on that because I saw more complications on the other, but we'll focus on this.
Yeah. So should we start?
Yep.
Okay. Just to let you know that I will need your full approval that I will be recording the audio of this interview so that I can transcribe it later on and use it for my thesis. Are you okay with that?
Yes, I am.
And do you want to be kept anonymous, or you want me to use your name?
Why don't I decide that later? Okay.
Sure. I mean, like, you want to see the question first.
Well, the reason I say that is, I had to sign certain agreements with Data Logic, right? Mm-hmm. So I need to be a little bit careful, and there may be some things I come and tell you later. This is something that in the end I got to make confident. I don't think that'll happen, but I got to be careful. Okay, so.
No problem.
I won't go into all the details. So what I would ask that we do is afterwards, basically we can make that decision, and I can also maybe have a little bit of time, just short bit of time after the call to think about, what that was, and then I can decide both. Is there anything that we need to be careful with, and is there any reason it has to be anonymous? And hopefully not. I doubt it. Okay?
Okay, that's okay. Okay, so just a couple of questions. First, what exactly are you specialized in when you were working for Data Logic?
Okay, well, I had two roles. One was I was the legal general director for Vietnam. Okay. Yeah. But I also had global responsibility for the ADC division's supply chain and operations. So I had a global responsibility around the world, mm-hmm. and as vice president of global supply chain operations, and then I had the general director role for 4 years at Data Logic Vietnam, with your father being general manager during that time.
Yeah. So the whole time you're working there was 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years directly, and then I first came over in 2008 mm-hmm. to do the site selection. Oh, so we went to sites. Me and John Burns. So he and I and Bill Parnell, my boss. So we went to multiple sites, and then we got made the proposal on the site. We got a business case proposal to the business that went to the board of directors, because it's a major investment. Mm-hmm. And then from there went forward, got the green light to go forward to start up that greenfield operation there. And at that time, of course, we put John Burns in sort of full-time on his own to try to get the thing started up.
Okay.
So that was 2008. I came on, I traveled there multiple times a year, quite frequently. And then in July of 2011, I started my full-time assignment, and it ended as general director, ended in August of 2015.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yep. So John was technically general director for 2 years. Uh-huh. And I took it the next 4. Mm. And one thing I would add, and we can talk about it later, but it was, I think it's tied back to this issue of starting operation and trying to have, let's say, a cohesive operation between a foreign company and a local company, to start with a general director that was from long-term experience with the company. Okay? And then, of course, what you see later is after 2 successive expat general directors, I recommended and got approval for your father to be promoted from general manager to also be general director, which is also part of a transition, both from a corporate view of comfortableness and also, let's say, from the expats that were working directly, that it was definitely time to make that change.
Okay, we can go deeper into that later on.
Yep. Yep.
And yeah, this is still in the getting general information topic question. So, was it the first time working abroad as a specialist or expat?
Not first time working abroad, in that I did that quite extensively, but it was the first time that I was an expat, i.e. I was based full-time in the country. Yes.
Okay.
So lots of world travel, but never an expat based running a local operation previous to this.
Okay, got it. Okay, still in the more general topic. So what was the best experience working in a company? So what was the best experience you ever find working for Datalogic in Vietnam?
Okay. Well, just so you're aware, I would say if I was asked the question, what was my best experience in my 30 years at Datalogic? This will give you context, okay? My best experience was actually my experience at Datalogic with Datalogic Vietnam, okay?
Okay.
So it was the entire experience, going from deciding where you were going to start the operation to starting the operation, right? And you go into a startup phase, and then seeing yourself go into a volume phase, right? And then into what I would call a maturity phase of the organization, and seeing the progress. I mean, not only achieving all the objectives that the business had and set out originally, and then a few in addition, but seeing the organization start up, grow, handle volume, and then become one that was what I would call fairly mature, that it could stand comfortably on its own and actually become a leader within manufacturing within the company. So that, the reason I say that too is I enjoy developing organizations and trying to have them develop into high performance organizations. And in this case, I was able to go from startup all the way to maturity. Okay.
Okay. So
now I would add something else to you, because that's very business related.
Yeah.
Working with I think I could have had a similar experience at other locations in the world, as far as what I just described from a business organizational view. But because of the people, it was also special from that standpoint, right? I think tied to the Vietnam people, their culture, openness, friendliness, and sort of the receptiveness that we received and the relationships that we developed, that was a part of, in addition to, and probably is what made it even more particularly special from an overall career view, right? And I think that's not, on one side you say, well, is it really related to your topic? I would argue it is. Because if people do not enjoy working together and have a good relationship, and good relationship means developing trust through that relationship, then typically organizations do not perform well. And I have been involved, I ran other organizations in foreign countries, and it was very, very difficult to develop the teamwork, cohesiveness, and strong relationship and trust that I feel the expats were able to develop with the local management staff in Vietnam. Didn't mean the other organizations didn't work okay, but they only worked okay because the expats were really considered foreign. And it was a barrier, that view, right? Whereas I felt more acceptance, and that it was a two-way street, right? The relationship and the trust was a two-way street.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, to catch up onto that. You say that you find it comfortable working with the Vietnamese team members.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain why? Like, can you elaborate why do you find it so comfortable working with the Vietnamese team members?
Sure. First of all, we can't put everybody into one box, right?
Yeah, I know that.
People are people.
Yeah.
So a lot of my perspective is obviously dealing with the management team, the first level of the management team, and some of the top people right directly below them. Clearly those that knew English, but those that were, let's say, top performers. So I would say that you got to look at it that way. So why? I think so the question was, why did we have comfort? Why did I have comfort working with them? A lot of it started out with the general manager, right? Your father, the general manager. I think established John Burns and him established a very good relationship early on. And then we got off on the right foot before hiring him when he came out to Oregon to develop, again, not only see data logic, but also to see whether he wanted to work with us and we wanted to work with him, not just from a technical knowledge standpoint, business standpoint, but also was it a good cultural fit, which is something, you can have different cultures, right? Yeah. But then there can be similarities that allow those two cultures to work. And even within cultures, people are different, right? So I felt that we started off by having establishing good relationship both ways with Fat. And he had people working with him that he had hired over many years that he was comfortable working with because they had a similar way of thinking, a way of doing things, which included a lot of willingness to exchange ideas, willingness to learn, and all that. So a lot of it was tied to the fact that, again, we developed a relationship with trust because there was openness on both sides to listen and understand, not just about business, but about cultural style differences and how to make things work. Okay? The fact that if the general manager had been a local manager that had never worked for a foreign company, okay? So if your father had never worked for a foreign company and you'd only known sort of the local business approach, first of all, he wouldn't have had the quality of English that he had, most likely, right? And number two, I think the style and approach wouldn't have been so similar because high-tech manufacturing has sort of its own culture and own approach in many respects about how you do things, how you manage processes and people, how you drive improvement. And so we were like talking the same language, right? So even though we'd come from different companies, the companies had a lot of similarities in how they looked at management, how they looked at manufacturing, and how they looked at quality, and delivery and service level to customers. And so we didn't have fundamental differences there because we were sort of already managing to the same global terminology and standard of expectation for quality, service level, delivery, et cetera, right? And how to drive process improvement. So again, this is pretty important because if you don't, there's language commonalities, but the language I'm talking about is a business language and a manufacturing language. And, how do you think about what excellent service is? And we didn't have to debate those issues at all. I would say it was like we had worked together our entire careers. Right? So now, the lower down I got in the organization with some of the key players, sometimes the more difficult it became. Because their view was much more what I would say is a more local perspective on what their job and their role is, which was different than for the same position that I would have for somebody in that job, let's say in Europe or in the USA. Okay? So the further down we went, the bigger the challenges were. And your father, I think, saw that also from a local view, even with his own team. Because what we had to do is we had to grow the people. Right? So the first line had been educated in that Japanese manufacturing approach, which is a global, same global type of thing we were educated in. And that made it easy because we had a similar business manufacturing language and set of expectations.
Okay. So the main reason is that same expectation, the fact that the general manager have been working for foreign companies for quite some time, so he knows how to manage and how to make the correct approach. And he has some kind of same perspective when the lower level of management didn't share the same kind of global perspective with you. So,
correct.
Yeah, that's the sum up.
Correct.
Yeah. So now we go through that, and you mentioned that you didn't work so well with the lower level of management. So
I didn't work so often.
Not so awful, but then you still find it a bit uncomfortable, right? Not awful.
It depended. If you go with the direct reports of Kang and Chung, not so difficult.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And language was not an issue. But if I got down to another level, let's say a senior planner, a guy running planning, then it could be more challenging. And so some would be easy, some would not be so easy. Now, I understand this is true in any business anyhow, because people are people. But the big example I can think about, which I also saw other examples that we had to deal with, but it was a situation where a planner ownership for whether the plan gets done.
Yeah, can you repeat that part? Because I lost connection for a while.
Okay. Yeah, I probably should plug in my. I think what's going on, we got a little noise outside, so let me plug in here. Okay. Garbage truck. You hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay, that's better. So an example I would use, a good example that I was thinking of when I made the comment earlier, we had a senior planner supervisor, okay, good person, right? I have no issue about the person. But their view of the job was a very narrow view of the job. And they would think about it from the perspective that as a planner, I put together a plan. But I'm not owning the plan, and I'm not accountable if the plan's achieved, because if production doesn't do something, or if purchasing doesn't get the materials, it's not my problem. And so I just report why we didn't make the plan. I come from a different world, which is one of I don't know if you heard of Harry Truman, but he was a president, and he had a famous line called "the buck stops here." The buck stops here, which means I'm responsible. I'll make the decision. I'm responsible. So that's the model I grew up under. And so when a planner puts a plan together, they're responsible and have ownership, and I can hold them accountable if they hit the plan regularly or don't hit the plan. Now, there are always reasons, but I expect them to not just give me the excuse of why they didn't hit the plan, okay? I expect them to start to understand why we're not hitting plans and try to work with the other people they work with to figure out how to get better so we hit the plan on a reliable basis. Part of this, to me, my view was it It was more extreme because I consider it a little bit more cultural locally. For somebody that was my job is very narrow, right? So I put a plan together, and that's what I do. And by the way, I don't want to take more responsibility, because if I do, I'm at risk. Okay? I'm at risk that I will get in trouble. I'm at risk I could lose my job. I'm at risk I could lose face. In the U.S., it's a little bit different, I'd say in general. I can't say that of everybody, but in general, which is when you don't take responsibility, even if you can't control, when you don't take responsibility, the view is you're just an excuse maker. You don't feel like, I understand you can't control your world, but we believe you can influence your world. And you should take the individual initiative to go make it as good as it can be made, but not just to say it's not my problem. I couldn't do anything, right? And that means saying, hey, yeah, today, I hate to say it, but we only made 50% of our plan. I know it's not acceptable. And the fact that it keeps happening says we got to do some things, and here's what I'm planning to do about it, right? This is what I expect. But I got to tell you, it was very, very difficult. And I saw it in other examples as well. And I think your father would tell you that trying to have people grow into this concept that they could influence and have ownership and drive improvements themselves instead of being directed by senior management. So the other thing I would comment on is what I saw initially was the deference to a senior manager. The good news is it was high deference and respect. The downside was they were waiting for somebody to tell them what to go do, right? And we come from a world where we don't wait for people to tell. I mean, it's not true everywhere in the U.S. and every business, but I would say most managers want organizations where their people feel empowered to go make positive things happen, even if they're not inside the box. They understand the world is gray. So we expect a gray world, and we expect you to take ownership, responsibility, and try to influence your whole environment to make things better, and don't make excuses. And not to wait for the senior manager to say, oh, we need to go do something. And so this is a microcosm, because I saw it in other examples, not necessarily working with me directly sometimes, but even people working with your father, general manager, where as we got to volume production and you didn't want everything to land on one person's shoulders, because I can tell you your father was carrying too much workload and too much pressure. So you can say the general manager whenever I say father, of course, right? Yeah. And you know what I told him? I said, this is not going to work, right? This is not going to work because we're going to keep growing this thing, and we have to develop the people, right? And so the Kings and the Chungs, they needed to develop, but they already had been developed for a long time under your father. So not such a big development, particularly Chung, not Chung, Kang, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is the lower part of the organization needed to develop to, let's say, a more international model of what you would expect in a business and in manufacturing. And I'm not saying that you couldn't go into a U.S. organization and have some degree of that, but it was like more of a shock because they weren't used to it. You know what I mean? So in the U.S., at least when you call somebody on and say, hey, you're not taking ownership, they sort of understand what you're saying because they know they've sort of been getting by. But when you say it in Vietnam, the person looked at me like, I have no clue what you're asking me. Why would you ask me to take responsibility and ownership for the whole when I cannot control the whole? You understand what I mean? So it's a different view, and I think part of that view is also not being so hierarchical and looking to the senior person and deferring only to them. We try to drive that ownership down, but also the empowerment to go make improvement down, and more freedom to drive that themselves, right?
Yeah.
So it's in varying degrees, but I did see it was a general theme as the organization went from a very small group and started hiring a lot of people from the outside and then had to develop. I saw a similar thing in Slovakia. It's just more of an issue of degree that I think it was a much bigger gap because of the differences in the culture. The reality is that Asians in general and the Vietnamese, because they defer, they tend not to want to step out into traffic and sort of say what they think. You have to pull them to say what they think. You have to push them to take ownership more, on average more. But that was true of some and not true of others, right? So it really depended on how much experience I think they had with a more international style, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't feel like there was this outright. If there was resistance, I never got resistance. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. If there was resistance, it was passive aggressive. But I really didn't even classify it as passive aggressive. I felt the issue was that the person was struggling to understand what we were trying to say and ask them to do. It was so foreign to them and so uncomfortable for them that I think it was just very difficult. So, but in the end, it was interesting in this one example, because the person would always sit aside from me in the meeting. Every meeting went about the same for the longest time, and we'd try to coach and and then one day I started to see a change in how they talked about things. And I kidded him one day and I said, you'd find it's much more comfortable to sit next to me than across from me. But I did that because I could tell that they didn't have the confidence to sit next to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because you're the boss.
Right? But this is something I told your dad as well. I said, not just for me, but for you, with these people that are not used to the same expectation, the high expectation we have and how we go about it, because I think your father would share that was true overall organization, not with some of the key people. But as you're trying to get the whole organization to perform at that level, the struggle was how to develop confidence. So what I realized, and I told him the same thing on some people he was working with, I said, the problem is, I think because we say, hey, this is not the way it should be, they almost were frozen. You know what I mean? They were frozen. They didn't have confidence. And so even though they heard it, it was more like, oh, you're complaining me. You're complaining me. You're complaining me. When really we were trying to hold them accountable, but also coach them. Okay, so we had to change the style a little bit to say, hey, look, you have to understand what let's get outside the meeting. Let's talk a little bit more about it. Let's continue to talk about outside the meeting and understand, even talk about the cultural issue that, this is not you that we're talking about. You may hear it that way. It's not you. It's what we expect in general. We need you to grow to do this so this company is successful and you're successful. And I actually said to them, the problem is you think you're going to get in trouble by taking more responsibility. What you don't understand is when you don't take more responsibility, you're getting in trouble with me. My perception of your performance and your attitude and everything is not good. So because if you think about what I'm asking for, don't worry. I said, don't worry about the risk that the plan is not right all the time. That's not my issue, right? My issue is that you own it and you will figure out how to make it better. Therefore, you need to not make excuses. And if you only make excuses to me, you have to understand I perceive your performance as poor. If you tell me the results aren't so good, but I'm working to make it better, then I have a positive perception of you. because that's ownership, that's accountability, that's empowerment. So it took quite a while for us to get people, I think, to understand what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it, that it wasn't focused on them. When we would talk, we wouldn't focus on them, but I think they perceived it that way. So we had to step back and try to help them understand that that's not what we were doing. We were trying to coach and have them see the bigger picture, and that the measurement of success was different than what they thought it was. So where they were afraid to step out because they thought that they could fail, we were telling them, no. When you step out, that's to us somebody that can most likely be successful by making things better, right? Well, it was culturally so different. It took a lot of time and effort to work through that, and we did. We never, in this planner's case, I never fired the planner, right? And then this one day, I could see they started to act differently, and then I kidded them a little bit about, hey, I'm always looking at you in the meeting, so if you sit over here, you might find out that you're not the person I always look at when I have a question. And like 3-4 weeks later, all of a sudden one day they were sitting next to me.
Just to feel the confidence.
And I looked over at him and I said, I didn't say anything in the first meeting. Second meeting, I said, I see this, because I wanted to see if it happened twice. I said, I see that you've decided you feel comfortable enough to sit next to me. And they go, yeah, I do. But part of that was also me trying to have them understand that you don't have to have this big gap within the hierarchy, right? It's okay to sit next to the big guy. It doesn't matter. Oftentimes in an Asian meeting, especially in Japan, it's by seniority you sit. Well, Fat didn't have to sit next to me, right? It was okay for her to sit next to me. So that's a microcosm of things I saw. Even if I wasn't dealing with the person, it seemed like if it wasn't some of the key high performers, that was the challenge as part of developing the organization to be higher performing. Okay?
That's answer almost everything. Well, I still have a couple more questions to ask, to understand deeper in your because what I just told you about the topics, right? And I mentioned that in the topics the problems that you have with the local teams, and you did explain that it was semi-cultural reasons, and also they also didn't understand how to work in an international organization, since they were so used to working in a local company where the hierarchy matters a lot, and they cannot do anything freely because their boss didn't allow them to do. Yeah.
Correct. But can I add one thing for you?
Yeah.
In the case of the general manager, your father, he has just like me, he has very, very high expectations for performance. And I can tell you, so I know this doesn't fit expat versus local quite as cleanly as you want, but I think you should know it, and then maybe you'll decide that there's another element that you want to address, or maybe you don't. It's up to you. Yeah. But what I found as we realized that the organization needed to not be so dependent on him, he ran into the same issues with trying to grow people. So they looked to him to say, it's time to drive improvement. And then he would ask people to drive improvement. And oftentimes he would find that it didn't go so well, right? Or the ownership accountability at the lower level wasn't quite as what he thought. He found oftentimes he had to be the one to get in and say, but wait, why can't we just go do this? So I would argue some of that maybe is capability needing to be developed, right? But I would also argue part of it, because it was so prevalent, right? More prevalent, I'd say, in this organization than I've seen in others, is that there's a cultural element as well. That they're waiting. I mean, you see it. I mean, you can see it going into a restaurant, right? Is it well organized or not well organized? If you have a manager there telling people what to do, it tends to get, in a Vietnam restaurant, if you have a good manager, things usually move pretty smoothly. If you don't have a good manager, and they just let people do what they want, it's chaos. You can't even get the right meal delivered to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's a very people dependent. The other way to do it is with process. So how do they do it in the U.S.? In a restaurant, you assign a waiter or waitress to own a table. One person owns the table. And again, like my example of the planner, it doesn't matter who screws up. Could be the cook, could be the guy making the drink, but guess who is responsible at the end as far as the customer is concerned? It's the waiter. And the waiter manages everything to make sure it's all done right. So instead of a manager up at the top saying, go cover table 3, get the drinks to table 4, they delegate and empower and give ownership to one person, right, to go do all that, who's also been trained about what is expected. So they're like a mini manager, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas I would argue if you go into some restaurants, I mean, you've seen them as well as I do in Vietnam, if you don't have that strong manager, and a lot of it, unless they're European or U.S., they usually don't assign a waiter, then what you find is it's a little bit of chaos. And I think the manager is the one that usually makes the difference between success and failure. But part of that's because they didn't delegate to the waiter or waitress that they're the manager of that customer and that table. And so I know that's just an example in a microcosm of a difference in restaurants, right? And not all restaurants, so don't get me wrong, but on average, you would say if you did an average, there's a gap there. Then you come over to business and you see a similar element as well. In this case, it's like about, maybe not I own my production line, but how do I drive improvement? Which means oftentimes I have to work with other functions and other departments. So again, I have to get outside the box and I have to be creative. I have to not want to be told. I want to be self-driven and be creative. And that's a big mind shift when you're used to a more hierarchical, I'm going to be told what I'm going to do and I'll try to do that very well approach. Now, I know I'm talking extremes, right? And it depends on people, but I can tell you, your father had a major challenge to get, not talking Kang, I'm not talking Chung so much, as you got deeper and deeper in the organization and it got bigger and bigger, to get people that understood how to do it without him having to say, here's what needs to be done. Now, you're never done. I mean, even in a U.S. organization, it's a challenge, right? But typically, I think at least the people know that you have the expectation. So when you hold their feet to the fire, they're not like, it's not like I don't understand what you want or I don't understand to do it. And so they get back on track quicker. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that actually makes interesting. That puts,
but also tell you, people
perspective to Ryan. Yeah.
But also tell you, people are people. So nothing I can tell you when I talk about culture or style. There's no one. I mean, there's maybe averages. Mm-hmm. But you can always find the full distribution in the. So if I went in 2 organizations, one in the U.S. and one in Vietnam, or let's just take Data Logic U.S. and Data, I could take those distributions and I would see a difference between the two, but I could still find people in both organizations at the high performance doing things the way I'm talking about, and then at the other side, not taking ownership, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more about an issue of average and how do you develop people, regardless of where they're from, right, to perform. And how do you do that? You do that with clear goals. Clear expectations, clear responsibilities, including understanding that it's not just a narrow job, and measuring them, holding them accountable, coaching them, and also helping train them on how to drive improvement. There are ways to drive improvement. It's not just you have to have a brilliant guy, but he's got process techniques he can use, right? My point is, you'll never be able to put a blanket around, hey, this or that. In the end, I would say the reason it worked so well is because people are people. You know what I mean? But I've also seen local organizations where it was more difficult, and talked to expats that worked in other local, where because they were mostly local and they hadn't dealt with it, it was a bigger challenge for them. You know what I'm saying? I felt like our challenge was not so significant because the general manager that led the day-to-day was in sync 100% with the general director, who also owned the global operation. You understand what I mean? So that made it easy. So was it super? I mean, we didn't do it overnight. We didn't get to maturity and high performance overnight, but it could have been an absolute nightmare. A lot of organizations fail when they try to start up a foreign organization, because they never get everybody in sync, right?
So it's more than just cultural, it's more than, how to say, incentive. And
incentive. I don't know if I use the term incentive. Probably I would come back, the key is develop relationships with good communication where you get on the same page. So a good relationship can develop trust. Being on the same page about what you're trying to accomplish and how, right, is the recipe for success. And it's a bigger challenge when you have two foreign organizations doing that. I felt the reason it worked was because both sides were also very open and willing to listen and respect each other. Right?
Yep, I agree with that.
But relationship and trust and common views helped that. But then if it would have been it's our way or the highway, we said, no. There are certain things that we think we need to do this, but let's listen to each other. And we also talked about culture quite a bit. We actually had I brought in the entire global team, and we sat and we talked. One of the key elements of this yearly planning meeting about how to drive improvement was about organization and performance. And we sat and talked about the differences in culture. Had Fat talk about, he probably still has the slides, talk about what's different about, what's the Vietnamese sort of culture and approach and way of thinking. Then we sort of wrote on the board, what do we think a U.S. is and what is an Italian? And we got this stuff out on the table and very early on and started talking about it, right, to try to understand the strengths and weaknesses and differences, because we realized that those differences could become a problem. But if we understand them, then we can be sensitive to them. Right? And I found that discussion, probably it was an hour and a half, to be a big help for everybody, both the expats, the local, and the guys that were on the global team, to think about how do you work together with people from foreign countries and be sensitive that there are differences, and those differences can create friction. But if we understand them, we can try to maybe not misunderstand what's happening, right? So I didn't feel like the planner was a loser. I didn't feel like the planner didn't care. I put it under the issue that the planner as an individual needed to grow and was taking more of a local view, and it was going to take time to coach and develop them. Now, did I know it was going to work for sure? I didn't know. But I know that we gave it a lot of time, which in my mind was patience in the way of time, because it wasn't like I felt like I was working in Eugene where, hey, they should know this. If they don't know it, they don't have it, or they don't want to have it. You know what I'm saying? So my fuse in Eugene or in the U.S. would have been very short for somebody with that experience. My fuse and my approach in Vietnam was much different. Partly because I traveled so much in the world and I picked up a lot of this work in Asia, partly because we had that workshop, and partly because your father and I would talk about these things on a regular basis. But I think also having expat people with local managers was a key to success, because, again, back to the relationship, the communication, getting on the same page, and passing knowledge, right? Whether it's cultural but more like technical, was very important. But you also see something else. We didn't put a huge number of expats in. We did not. I mean, if you go look at a lot of Korean companies, the first level of management, general director and his first level, are all Korean, right? We didn't do that. Why? Because I've managed other foreign organizations, and what I realized was, if you could try to have a local management team with a strong local leader because of these cultural issues and the language issues. So, in another plant I had, even though it was in the same region, they were different countries and different languages, and it was a very good senior manager leading that plant, and they got good results, but I never found that the entire local organization felt that it was local, because there were so many, call it expats, including the general manager, general director. Then they felt like it was more of a foreign company that they happened to work with. I wanted them to feel like it was more of a, yes, it's a foreign company, but they feel like it's also a local company because they have that senior management team, right, who can speak the language, understand the culture, be on top of issues before they become big problems like strikes. We saw strikes in the area, oftentimes with companies that were run predominantly by expats who got out of sync with what was going on, right? Yeah. So I deliberately wanted to hire a general manager like your father and have a team with a few expats so we could get everybody up to speed. And then over time, we were going to wean ourselves out of the expats, which we did. Right?
Okay, so you give solutions, you give me problems, you give me examples, and also the reasons for the problems. I think we covered the entire topic so far.
Well, I have a problem for you. I have a problem for you, though. I want you to know about, and you probably already know about. But if I go look at the expats that we had, the other thing I would comment on in general, I think it was fairly easy for the U.S. expats to be accepted and integrate into working with the organization. Okay?
Yeah.
First of all, and your father identified this when we talked about the difference in cultures, there's, I don't know, maybe it's changing, but at the time there was this Vietnamese would tend to look up favorably on the Western countries and want to learn from them. Okay? So they tended to give you respect very quickly. You were a senior person, whether you were Chuck Orlick in the engineering group or Randy Person in engineering or myself. The reality is we were senior people, so that tended to give us respect from a hierarchical view. We were from a Western country, and they were eager to learn. And because we were open to knowing a little bit about the culture and the people and the language, albeit none of us got very good at the language, and we were open on working, together and exchanging ideas. I felt like it went very quickly. Right? I'm not saying there were never issues, but honestly, went very well. Might even been more difficult if we had moved to the east side of USA and walked into a company. It probably would have been more difficult, right? And part of that's cultural. I think cultural for the Vietnamese people and how they looked at at least folks from the USA that approached them the way we did. But we brought in an assistant general director from Italy who was Viet Q. Viet Q, right? You understand?
I don't understand that word.
Viet Q. That means he was Vietnamese that left the country after the war, or just at the end of the war. So they call him Viet Q, and then he comes back.
Viet Q. Okay. I didn't realize he was making.
I figured it was a small issue, but anyhow.
Yeah.
So, and I've heard this observation from other people, local and expat. But it seems to me very difficult for a Viet Q to come into a Vietnamese organization and quickly get the same acceptance as the people did from the USA. Okay?
Or even the fellow Vietnamese.
Well, maybe. I don't know. What I've heard, and this example matches what I heard, is there's a general perception, stereotype, right? Stereotype, you'll always find examples, but that when the Viet Q first started coming back to the country, they were fairly arrogant. And because they'd been away for so long, many of them left when they were very young, they really weren't in tune, even though they could speak the language, they really weren't. They had been westernized. They weren't really Vietnamese in their approach. And so this view, this perception, makes it very difficult for a Viet Q person who's grown up most of their life in a Western country to come in. They have to work harder to get the respect and the acceptance than we did. Now, because I think people look at us and they go, okay, well, your Vietnamese isn't good. Well, okay, we know it's not good because you're from the U.S. and we don't really ever expect, but if you try a little bit, thank you, right? But when the Viet Q doesn't speak very well, it's a little bit, okay. And then when they see them not acting culturally the same, and they already have this view that you're sort of arrogant, and even if they may be trying to do the same things that we're trying to do, there's a sensitivity to it that makes it more challenging, which is something that blew me away. If you said to me, Brad, before you went to Vietnam, do you think a group of U.S. managers would have the biggest challenge to be accepted and integrated in DataLogic Vietnam, or a Vietnamese Italian? I would say, well, of course it'll be the U.S. people. Of course. But it's not the way it worked. And I know that DataLogic Vietnam is not the only organization that has seen this issue. Okay? And I don't know if your fathers ever spoke to you about this situation or not.
I think he did, but I think it was a long time ago. It's like 3-4 years ago. I think I picked him up. I went to dinner with him even.
But I would say that if you said to me, where was the difficulty? This was the difficulty. and it's hard to. I'm sure your father has a different view on this, but I just know from talking to others that it's been a challenge for other organizations, right? And sometimes if people are just going to be, if they're just feel accepting of you as they start to meet you and the wall is down, then if you behave in at least a decent way, things can go well. But if they're already sort of with a wall that's up a little bit and sensitive, it's more difficult. And I think the person coming that's the Vietnamese Viet Q from a Western country, he doesn't perceive that I think he perceives it will be easier for him than it will for the U.S. guys. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
So he perceives it different, to be less challenging, just like I was perceiving it should be less challenging. But because of sensitivities, right, then really, if anything, he has to be even more adept to be accepted. He has to be more sensitive to how people think about him. And he almost needs to be a little less Western. Now, I can't tell you how much of this is due to the individual, because there's always individual factors. How much is due to the sensitivity and view of the Vietnamese versus a lot of Viet Qs, right? But they've worked together. In this case, the individual regularly said and tried to reinforce, I'm not Vietnamese, I'm Italian.
So identity.
So you have to understand, when he went to Vietnam, he got put in a refugee camp first. And then when they sent him and his uncle out, they got put in a high mountain hamlet in Italy, small, where, believe me, nobody thought of him as being Italian, right? I mean, either you're a true Italian or you're not true Italian. So this is what when he was a kid, he got put in. So he's been fighting his whole life to be perceived as Italian. But when you come over to Vietnam, right, it struck me as strange that he kept trying to reinforce to me that he was Italian so much, right? Which I think infiltrated his style and approach. And by the way, he'd lived there most of his life. And I even saw some basic cultural things that because he did have family in Vietnam, right? Left his parents and his family sent him away. They said, hey, you go with your uncle. We can always send you out and everything. But what I found was because he hadn't grown up and been indoctrinated day in and day out, he took more of a European approach with less sensitivity to the Vietnam cultural approach. Mm-hmm. And that made it even more difficult. And in the end, he never integrated into the organization. Now, I think there were other factors going on. I think part of it was this perception challenge in the wall, partial wall. Part of it was the person. But he also didn't realize, I think, that it would be such a challenge in the sensitivity. And if I would have, if I had understood it, I would have tried to help make it, up front, tried to address it, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got a strong local team, I think, that maybe if you didn't perform absolutely excellent, if you were only average, it just wasn't going to work. You had to walk on water or it was going to be hard to work. So there are a lot of factors involved, but I can tell you that I think being a Viet Q, I don't care whether you're from the US or you're from Europe, is a bigger challenge than anybody assumes that's from the foreign country, right? We just don't get it. But I know if I walked into a company in the U.S. on the East Coast or in Texas, you can't just assume you're going to walk in and everything's going to be fine, because the regional cultures are different. And you have to be sensitive to that. But I think it was easier for us to integrate into a Vietnam organization, right, than it would be for us to go into other U.S. organizations, because I think we were accepted so readily. You know what I mean? Willingly and readily, which is, to me, there is a cultural issue there, and this deference and respect. So we could screw it up, but if we were open-minded, we wanted to know about the people, the culture, and interchange ideas, the door was fully open for us. We could only shut the door. In the other case, the door wasn't fully open. And if you weren't careful, you could close the door fast. That was the biggest issue that I saw. And it's something that I've heard from many other managers in other companies as well.
That's something new. I didn't think of that at all when I was working on my thesis. That not just expat, but also people who are Vietnamese by birth, but live in a different nation and come back to Vietnam to work. Are there?
And he's got an Italian passport, so he is an expat, by the way.
He is an expat, but by paperwork, but his blood. He is Vietnamese, but he's not really Vietnamese.
No, and what it is, it's an example of two worlds, and his culture is a blend of two cultures, right? At least two cultures, right? So in a way, he's not Vietnamese. In a way, he's actually, from an Italian view, he's not Italian. I hate to tell you. The Italians, I'm not saying all Italians, but in general in Europe, if you say you're German, it's not because you can't say you're German to a German that's lived there, his family's lived there their entire life, because it's not the passport, it's your bloodline. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the bloodline. Yeah.
Now it's starting to change, but believe me, when he went into Italy, you're really a true Italian, or you can tell me you're Italian. I don't care what the passport says. You're not Italian.
I get it. I kind of get that too sometimes.
And he's a first generation.
Fresh.
He's a first.
Yeah, fresh.
Yeah, he's a fresh generation. So, and I think this one is actually an excellent one for your paper. I think sort of compare contrast, right? Yeah. With this, I will say, I thought the person was, I think, were well-meaning. In retrospect, I wish that I had anticipated and understood the challenge that was there. And I don't know if we had, whether it would have been successful or not, but I know that was a key, let's say, made it much more difficult and less likely for success. And then we parted ways, basically, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean,
okay.
I guess I don't have anything else to ask you. You cover almost everything without even me asking.
When you got the recording, you can have fun listening to it again.
I hope I didn't mess that up. I really hope I didn't mess that up.
I hope so too.
Yeah, I hope I didn't mess it up. I'm still recording all my thoughts.
I mean, what you may want to do is just take a few minutes and write some key themes down before you forget about them, because in the end, you got to distill it. I know you're trying to do that, so.
Yeah, I'm trying to memorize and write this stuff. It's a bit hard. This is my first interview, so I have to improve on next time. I wasn't really prepared for this one. I was so unprepared. Now I know what to do. I was panicking.
I would say your questions were good. I think what you have to always expect, I'm going to have to I'm gonna struggle remembering Teddy, but you're gonna always have to remember to come prepared to, even if they've reviewed it, to review with them here's why we're here today. Here's what my subject. Here's what so I want to review it again so you're clear. Even if they read it, oftentimes there's a little bit for you to add perspective or context. And then, now here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you, you tell them what you're going to go do, right? And then at the end, I'm going to give you time to add, feel free, however you want to do it. Feel free to add things, or I'd like to go through my questions. Then we'll have a time where you can add things, whatever you want to do. But you sort of have to set the stage and then manage it. Yeah, and so the only thing I would say is not being, having to go check and say, what is it that we're talking about, right? You always want to have that ready to go, right? So it's no big deal. This is all part of you guys growing and learning, right? So it's not a big deal. Now, when you get into business, you'll have learned this, so you don't have to learn the hard way.
Yeah. I guess this kind of helped me preparing for the next interview. Oh, by the way,
exactly.
I'm having an interview with, I think you know him, Christian Finati.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm interviewing him tomorrow morning. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be a lot different because he's Italian and he's working, and I think he's younger than you, so he has a different view.
Oh, yeah. We're almost all younger than me now, so.
Yeah.
Well, Christian's a great guy. The only thing that when you tell me you're going to talk to Christian, the only thing I would say is when you described your subject, I asked you, is it about working with Vietnam or is it only expat with Vietnam? He was never an expat, at least in my view. To me, an expat is, and maybe our definitions are different. To me, an expat, or the common definition of an expat, is somebody who resides full-time in the country on assignment. Because remember, I asked you, well, what about the interaction between the global team with the Vietnam team? And you said, no, I want to keep it narrow. So I guess I'm not clear. What do you mean by expat?
Oh, what I mean by expat? Well, I did say in my topic that I allow some verification of expat. You can twist it a bit. You can say foreign specialist in Vietnam. You don't have to be actually expat. You can just be a foreigner working in data logistics for a certain period of time. It doesn't need to be constant, but it has to be long enough that you have some kind of friction and conflict with the local team and something that I can work on.
Yeah, but here's the thing I would add to you. All these people like Christian, who were part of the global team, and for a while he had some direct reports as well from Vietnam. They all came over periodically and visited, but what you need to understand is a lot of their view is not just a view of when they're there. It's also a view of remotely dealing with it.
Yeah, that can be good. I can make my thesis or my report a bit more, more wide and depth.
Right. So that's what I was trying to say earlier.
Yeah.
And you said I want it to be more narrow. I think you're better off doing what you're now talking about doing. And what I was going to add to you is the bigger challenge to me wasn't the expats that were based full-time in Vietnam working with it. It was the remote interactions. And by the way, the remote interactions, I don't care whether it's Vietnam with Italy, Vietnam with U.S., or Italy with U.S., the remote interactions of foreigners with each other are the most difficult and most challenging. Okay? And so I think it's a good one to look at, but I can just tell you that when I'm working day to day in the organization,
yeah,
and you have time to talk and communicate and see and everything, things can go pretty smoothly. When you're remote, what you start to see over time, especially if there isn't frequent face-to-face meeting, you start to get disconnects, frustrations. Why don't they understand? Why aren't they giving me what I want? And so the remoteness makes it more challenging. It means you have to work at making it work. You know, having video conference calls instead of teleconference, having regular one-on-ones, having regular meetings, having regular video calls in particular, coming over periodically to spend a week or two with the local staff. If you don't do those things, what happens is things start to break apart. Okay? But it's not just Italy or U.S. with Vietnam. This is a
Global.
international phenomena,
Yeah.
but the cultural aspects and styles make them even, let's say, magnify the problem. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I got it.
Then when you're there on a day-to-day basis. So
Yeah, I give it a thought. I
think it's
Yeah.
I think it's a good one. Christian's a great guy. I don't know if you've spent much time with him, but you'll find it'll be a great interview.
Yeah, thank you for everything. You helped me a lot. This is a lot of information. This is a lot of data that came up on. So much stuff that I didn't even know. Even though I'm very close to my dad regarding like companies issues and stuff, I barely know all that stuff. But yeah, thanks for everything.
Okay. Hey, can I add one last thing for you? One last thing.
Yeah.
One of my big issues, I can't say it's cultural necessarily, is when you have a global organization, the local organization communicating to the global and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to add this to you at the last second, but the big problem I saw was around people. When the general manager wanted to move a key person elsewhere in his organization, and the global person, that person worked in that organization, that had to be discussed together, face-to-face, to avoid issues. But when it wasn't, and things were already moving, it created disconnects, frustration, etc. So it's very important, particularly when you're talking about changing processes, changing people, where the global organization has some level of direct or indirect ownership, but it's somebody that's either key or a key process. It's very critical that those things be addressed up front before they are finalized and implemented. And we had a number of instances where that didn't happen. And the good news is, because we had people that respected each other and had good trust, we worked them out. But if it wasn't quite as strong and the people didn't see each other quite as frequently face to face, it could have been a huge problem. Okay, that's it.
Got it. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
All right, Teddy, have a
Bye. Have a nice day.
Yeah, have a great weekend and good luck on the paper. I look forward to. I would hope at some point you could share it with me. I'd love to read it. Okay, so
I will keep you updated on it as soon as I finish it.
All right. Good luck with school and take care.
Good luck. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah. Goodbye.